Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Junior English. We now turn in your textbooks to page 460, 461 and following. These are the introductory comments for unit number 3. Note your dates right away on page 461, 1850 to 1914. Notice the topic here that's provided for unit 3, division, reconciliation, and expansion, literature of the Civil War and the frontier. We have a quote on page 461 from Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address of 1865. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Let's turn now to the next page, 462, to get a snapshot of the period as we have seen in earlier readings of units 1 and 2. The years, I'm reading now on page 462, and again, all you have to do now is just be taking notes at level 1, just bullet pointing the information as we find it. Make sure that you get headings. Of course, you're writing down any important dates and the like. The years between 1850 and 1914 witnessed a transformation of the United States. During those years, America came of age. The country changed from a decentralized, mostly agricultural nation to the modern industrial power we know today. This transformation began in the period leading up to the Civil War. In that war, Americans took up arms against one another to determine which should prevail: the Union of the North or the Confederacy of the South, the Federal Union or states' rights, freedom or slavery. As the Civil War began, each side possessed significant strengths and notable weaknesses. The North had a tremendous advantage in population and was far more industrialized and thus better prepared to wage war than the agrarian South. However, the Confederacy had the psychological advantage of greater motivation. It was fighting for its very survival. The South also had a strong military tradition and notably fine leaders. When the struggle was over, the North won, the Union held, slavery was abolished, but all at a devastating cost to the nation. Of course, you have maps on the page 463 there, and some graphs as well to give you some information. Let's turn now to 464, the historical background, the Civil War era, and let's go to work now with 1850 to 1914. Again, we're just taking notes as we hit any kind of heading. Make sure that you've got at least a couple of things written down under each of these headings. Between the Civil War and World War I, which will begin in 1914, America changed dramatically. The period began with cotton plantations and the Pony Express, and it ended with cars, airplanes, telephones, and movies. The Civil War scarred everyone, soldier, civilian, slave, and the shift from agriculture to industry accelerated. No American's life would ever be the same. First heading, Prelude to War. The North and the South had developed differently. Commerce ruled the North and King Cotton ruled the South. The Industrial Revolution, advances in transportation, and a tide of immigration turned northern cities into centers of bustling activity. By contrast, cotton plantations and the system of slavery defined the South. Issues such as what to do about fugitive slaves and whether new states should be slave states or free states dominated politics. Rage and resentment grew. War was waiting. Next heading, Brother against Brother. When Abraham Lincoln, dedicated to halting the spread of slavery, was elected president in 1860, South Carolina and 5 other states left the Union and established the Confederate States of America. Fighting began at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Many on both sides anticipated a short war. No one could know what lay ahead. The carnage of Antietam, where more than 26,000 men fell in a single day. The deprivation of the siege of Vicksburg, where people survived only by eating dogs and rats. The destruction of Georgia when Union troops marched to the coast. The devastating Civil War lasted 4 long years. By the time Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant in the spring of 1865, over 600,000 American soldiers had lost their lives over 4 years. Think about Worland as a town of 5,000 people and divide 600,000 simply into 5,000 to get a sense of how many Warlands died in 4 years. The South lay in ruins, its cities, farms, and plantations destroyed. The future looked grim. Just after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and the exhausted, war-torn nation faced the huge task of reconstruction without him. Top of page 465, the next heading, Americans Go West. After the Civil War, physical expansion and industrialization transformed the American landscape, economy, and society. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised 160 acres to anyone who would live on the land for a certain period and improve it. This shifted the Western movement into high gear. 500,000 farmers, including tens of thousands of emancipated African Americans, staked their claims on the Great Plains. Miners went west with dreams of gold sparkling in their eyes. In 1869, workers drove the last spike in the Transcontinental Railroad. The next heading, the frontier disappears. By 1890, the frontier had ceased to exist. Settlers, railroads, mines, ranches, and the slaughter of the buffalo had transformed the West. In place of open range were plowed fields, grazing lands, and miles of fences. Gone too were the Indian nations. By 1890, almost all Native Americans in the West had been forced from their lands. Read that line again. By 1890, almost all Native Americans in the West had been forced from their lands. The next heading, the Electric Society. When electricity entered the scene in the 1880s, the second industrial revolution began. Americans began to enjoy electric lights, telephones, automobiles, motion pictures, skyscrapers, along with noise, traffic, and air pollution. Urban populations exploded. Millions of immigrants provided cheap labor. Low wages, child labor, and disease were the norm for the working class, while a handful of industrial giants lived like kings. Mark Twain perfectly summarized the contradictions of this era when he called it the Gilded Age. We have three important historical themes pointed out here: painful growth and electric change. 1. The Civil War left the nation physically, economically, and emotionally devastated as Reconstruction began. 2. Riding the railroad. Americans moved west and annihilated the frontier. 3. The age of electricity transformed everyday life. Cities, with all their pleasures and problems, expanded rapidly. All right, let's turn to page 466. We have, as you know from reviews of Units 1 and 2, we have some essential questions across time. Let's look at each of them in order. The Civil War and the Frontier, 1850 to 1914. Question 1, how does literature shape or reflect society? First question underneath that, what literary forms did writers use to discuss social and political issues during this period? We have several. Let's list them, starting with spirituals. Although spirituals were sung, not written down, they were the form of literature that grew directly out of the major social and political issue of the time, slavery. Born in the rhythms of work and based on biblical imagery, spirituals were lyrical expressions of lamentation, comfort, and hope. Songs like Go Down Moses and Swing Low Sweet Chariot made it possible for slaves to at least imagine release into a better life. Next heading, life stories. Nonfiction in which men and women related the dramatic events of their lives also gave literary form to the issues of the era. Sojourner Truth's first-person account of her life and Frederick Douglass's autobiography were true life narratives of bondage and freedom. Richly detailed diaries, such as the one kept by Confederate wife Mary Chestnut, as well as the journals and letters of countless Civil War soldiers, remain valuable and moving literary resources that turn abstract issues into the daily realities of actual human beings. Next heading, fiction and journalism. With Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, fiction stepped up to play a major role in the politics of the era. Newspapers, too, took stands on a wide variety of issues and provided forms for editorials, essays, and public letters. After the Civil War, investigative journalists called muckrakers wrote blistering exposés of corruption, scandal, and incompetence in American industries. Do note as well on page 466 those three vocab words for yourself there. They will end up on the exam. 467, next question. How did popular literature reflect the era's social and political issues? First heading, rags to riches. As America's cities grew, the struggle against crushing urban poverty became a fact of life for more and more people. Many readers turned to the young adult novels of Horatio Alger to find inspiration on the hard road to success. Alger's rags to riches stories of young men finding fame and fortune through right thinking and moral actions were immensely popular, selling more than 20 million copies. Next heading, twists and turns. William Sidney Porter started out as a journalist, worked in a bank, went to prison for embezzlement, and became a short story writer. Under the name O. Henry, he published hundreds of tales of ordinary city dwellers and became one of the most popular writers in America. His stories are often humorous episodes that include twists of fate. Beneath the light-hearted surface, however, his ironic surprise endings suggest how much people felt their lives were subject to coincidence and chance. The next heading, The West and the Wizard. Millions of Americans who never set foot on a prairie or in an open range love the Western novels of Zane Grey. The closing of the frontier encouraged a romantic view of the Lost West, and Grey capitalized on that vision with exciting tales of self-reliant cowboys, many of which were later turned into movies. Industrial-age Americans found escapism in a different kind in L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, 1900, a fantasy so popular it led to 13 sequels. Let's pause on 467 for a second. We've got the American experience, art in the historical context, realism in painting, the Ashcan School. Let's just read together. At the turn of the 20th century, a group of artists working in Philadelphia, New York, realized that city life was fertile ground for a new kind of imagery. They shared the basic principles and attitudes of realism, and they developed ways of conveying realism visually. These painters were aware that America was becoming increasingly urbane, and they wanted to depict this new steel and concrete reality. They painted the grubby and the drab, as well as the hectic and the colorful. These frank and honest painters include Robert Henry, William Glackens, and George Lux. Some critics insultingly call them the ash can, garbage can school, a label that has endured but is no longer an insult. One prominent ash can painter was John Sloan, 1871 to 1951. Sloan said that he saw the city as, quote, a vast stage set where all sorts of lively business was in progress, end quote. His painting, 6 O'Clock Winter, shows the lively business of New York City rush hour. There you have the picture for you. You can obviously Google image more of these artists' work. We have on 468 the American experience contemporary connection, Mark Twain, the original time traveler. Just read with me for a few minutes here. In his novel, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Mark Twain places a present-day hero in the distant past. Twain said the idea was inspired by a dream in which he was, quote, a knight-errant in armor in the Middle Ages, end quote. When the book was published in 1889, the Boston Herald raved of all the extraordinary conceits that have germinated in his fruitful imagination. Nothing more delicious has ever occurred to Mark Twain than that of running riot among the legendary times of our ancestral race, end quote. While he must have enjoyed the book's success, Twain probably never imagined its long-term effect. Indeed, the time travel tale, now a familiar device in science fiction, is widely regarded to have begun with Twain's book. Perhaps because of this, many science fiction writers have a fondness for Twain. He often appears as a character in sci-fi books, films, television shows, and comics, including the following brief list of examples. The River World series by Farmer, To Sail Beyond the Sunset by Henlon, Star Trek The Next Generation, Time's Arrow episode, the Sandman graphic novel series by Neil Gaiman, the Transformers Evolution's Hearts of Steel comic book series. All right, let's go on to 469 and continued questions. How did social and political issues lead to realism and naturalism? The war was over. The unthinkable had happened. Americans had tried to slaughter each other. Although the outcome of the war had given the nation a hard-won sense of unity, the enormous cost in human life had shattered the nation's idealism. Like the hero of Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage, Americans had lost their innocence. The youthful sense of enthusiastic optimism that had built the country had faded away. Frustrated, Unfulfilled, young writers turned away from the romanticism that was popular before the war. They threw away their rose-colored glasses and saw the world for what it was. They became realists. Next heading, the common life. American writers began to focus on creating portrayals of real life as ordinary people lived it. They attempted to show characters and events in an honest, objective, almost factual way. In prose, Willa Cather wrote unflinchingly of the loneliness and cultural isolation of life on the prairie. In poetry, Edwin Arlington Robinson created unsparing psychological portraits of a variety of small-town characters. In Spoon River anthology, Edgar Lee Masters presented a disturbingly candid portrait of small-town life in the form of epitaphs spoken by the dead themselves. The next heading, naturalism. Like realists, naturalists also depict ordinary people in real-life situations, but they took it a step further. They believed that forces far more powerful than any individual shaped human destinies. Indifferent nature, blind fate, heredity, pure chance, these determined the lives of men and women. Even fierce self-interest was not enough to guarantee success or survival. Jack London, for example, set much of his fiction in the Alaskan wilderness where the frigid environment was unforgiving. The naturalist theme of human endurance in the face of overwhelming natural forces pervades his fiction. The atmosphere of urban life fed naturalism too, as people recognized that industrialization, mechanization, and anonymity were forces against which individuals were increasingly powerless. Let's go to page 470, the next question. What is the relationship between literature and place? First question under that, what elements of the physical environment affected Northern writers' attitudes? First heading, industry. The growth of industry in the North radically changed the landscape, and the landscape profoundly affected the thoughts, attitudes, and values of the people. In fact, change itself became a significant value. Technological advances in manufacturing, transportation, and the conveniences of daily life encouraged Northerners to believe that anything bigger, stronger, faster, and newer was necessarily better. Urban life. On the other hand, the increased sizes and populations of northern cities led to a host of urban problems and discontents. Conflicts arose over the treatment of immigrants, the role of organized labor, and the causes and effects of poverty. Writers were particularly sensitive to what was happening to the spirits, the emotions, and values of people crowded into cities and working at mind-numbing jobs in factories. The next question, what elements of the physical environment affected Southern writers' attitudes? Regionalism, first heading. The South, of course, had cities too, but overall it remained a predominantly rural environment. Agriculture had always been at the heart of the economy, but the war had devastated the plantation system and abolished slavery, radically altering the Southern way of life. Nevertheless, Southern writers focused on the distinctive qualities of their geographical setting. Like writers in other parts of the country, Southern regionalists used the features and color of the local landscape to tell stories that seemed to grow out of the land itself. Next question. How did expressions of place show up in literature? By the way, do note that on 470 you've got the 3 vocab words you want to pay attention to. Question again. How did expressions of place show up in literature? The first heading, local color. Almost as a conscious national reaction to the Civil War, writers all over the country seemed to realize how precious each separate part of the country could be. In the Northeast, South, Midwest, and West, writers began to feature characters and details that were unique to a particular geographic area. Characters spoke in dialect, linking themselves to a specific locale. Landscapes were so fully integrated into stories that they virtually became characters. Descriptions of customs, clothing, manners, and attitudes all contributed to a literature of local color. The mining camp sketches and stories of Bret Harte made the West, especially California, a lively locale in the American literary imagination. Hamlin Garland and Willa Cather found hardship and tragedy, sometimes touched with romance, on the farms of the Midwest. Huck Finn told stories like the adventures of Mark Twain told stories like the adventures of Huckleberry Finn that are so deeply intertwined with the landscape of the Mississippi River, we cannot imagine them happening in any other place. In Maine, Sarah Orne Jewett created delicate and unforgettable New England ideals. And in Louisiana, Kate Chopin told wrenchingly realistic stories of life in the bayous. Urban sophistication. Not all realism, however, was set on farms and small towns and on riverboats. Some American writers were also comfortable in elegant drawing rooms. Edith Wharton wrote novels and stories about repressive customs and the Eastern high society into which she had been born. William Dean Howells applied his brand of realism to New England novels of manners and class. Urban subtlety and sophistication found its greatest American essayist, analyst in Henry James. Often placing his Americans back in Europe, James probed deeply into characters motivated by complex mixes of desire, honor, ambition, and guilt. On 471, let's turn to the box, The American Experience Developing American English, Mark Twain and the American Landscape, again by Richard Leder. On February 18, 1885, 3,000 copies of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn were released, and the novel changed the direction of American letters. Twain used everyday speech instead of formal standard English. He used 7 distinct dialects to reflect the speech patterns of his characters, and he showed the vitality of the American idiom in narratives as well as in dialogue. Huckleberry Finn is the first novel of world rank written entirely in American. Readin', Writin', and Twain, the heading. Twain held strong opinions about a passel of subjects. Here are a few things he had to say about the American language that he helped to shape. On dialects, he said, "I've traveled more than anyone else, and I've noticed that even the angels speak English with an accent." On choosing words, the difference between the almost right word and the right word is really a large matter. 'Tis the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. On style, in a letter to a 12-year-old, "I notice that you use plain, simple language, short vowels and brief sentences. That is the way to write English. It is the modern way and the best way. Stick to it, and don't let fluff and flowers and verbosity creep in." Let's go to 472. What makes American literature American is the question, and the first sub-question under that, what literary elements contributed to an American style? First heading, settings and plots. Unique local settings were